Hello everyone, I am Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with Moving Up the Limits, which is a quickie series, and today we're going over No Limit 200. No Limit 200, the limit where the money is really, really good. No Limit 200 is where players start making very good money. The best No Limit 200 players make over $100 per hour, and the variance above No Limit 200 is sickening. Lots of people get stuck at No Limit 200 due to the money being good, there being much less games at higher stakes, and the variance above No Limit 200 being very tough to swallow as win rates get smaller. There is a very good mix of regulars at this stake. At No Limit 200 Rush, you would find some bad No Limit 200 and No Limit 400 regulars, as well as some very good ones, with most being in between. So remember, just because a player plays a higher limit, you have a lot of people that rake back grind No Limit 400, which is much less effective than even winning a small win rate at No Limit 200. But at No Limit 200 specifically, since there are so many tables where there aren't always a bunch of tables at all times of the day at higher limits, you get a very, very large mix of rakes. Fewer regulars means that there are more opportunities to exploit specific opponents and more opportunities for them to exploit you. Remember, anytime you try to exploit someone else and you're not taking a game theoretically correct line, it gives them the chance to exploit you. Playing against No Limit 200 regulars. There are several leaks most No Limit 200 regulars have. This is the limit I've played the most, so it's actually the one I'm most comfortable with for making this video, and I know most regulars have the inability to make very large bluffs at the appropriate frequencies. There are players who can do it, they don't occur often enough. Range is still way too weighted towards value in general, especially when the other player can have strong hands in their range. I think when players move up in limits in general, they have the tendency to sort of imagine the higher limit is where everyone's super good and your old tricks won't work and everyone's better in balance. That's not really true at all. At No Limit 200, if you can have the nuts in your range, it's pretty unlikely your opponent's going to pull a big bluff, because sometimes you're just going to have the nuts or near the nuts and he's just going to throw away his stack when that happens. Even when you can't have the nuts in your range, people still don't tend to bluff nearly enough. So, keep that in mind for No Limit 200. You're still going to have to take that sort of standard folding line if you're showing aggression at your opponent and your opponent shows aggression back. He's probably not bluffing enough, and then the few players that are bluffing enough, you need to take notes. Afraid to take risky lines which may make additional streets more difficult to play or result in being outdrawn. Few people will slow play a set on a 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 5 of clubs flop. Since few people will slow play here, that allows you to bet larger and bet more frequently on a later street because they can't be strong, assuming the turn card didn't put a bunch of strong hands in their range. At No Limit 200, you can still have a extremely healthy win rate. In fact, it might even be best against the vast majority of opponents to sort of just take really obvious lines and not worry about being exploited. So usually, people will take an obvious line and raise a strong vulnerable hand rather than risk slow playing it, because if the opponent's not going to overbet the following street or bluff a huge frequency of the time, there's no need to really slow play there. So even fewer people will punish people for not doing this by overbetting the following street. I already just mentioned that. And people at this limit have an inability to access the entire bet sizing spectrum, which relates to that previous point. People usually say to themselves, should I bet 65% of the pot here or check? That's people's thought processes in a lot of spots. Usually these are the more mediocre regs, so maybe they have a very small win rate or they're breaking even or even slightly losing players that don't know it yet. But a lot of people just have this thought process where they think they have to either bet one amount or check. They don't consider betting all these other sizes. These edges are smaller and require more effort to fix than previous leaks, but $100 an hour is really, really good. So yes, it's not these nosebleed, life-changing, stakes that some people play. But if you look at any sort of reasonable wages in the real world, if you can make over $100 an hour, that is a really a lot of money, and there are people that are going to be willing to work pretty hard to do that. Taking risky lines. If I am reviewing someone's play who plays No Limit 200, I require them to take the most plus EV line at all times. No excuses. Stop raising flops against opponents where slow playing is better, for example. So I just want to pause on this for 1 second because I think this is probably the most important concept in this video. At really low limits, I'm more okay with taking a line that you feel comfortable with rather than putting yourself in an awkward spot where you might end up making a big mistake. At No Limit 200, we're kind of past that point. We need to take the most plus EV line pretty much at all times, even if that's going to make the hand much more difficult to play. edges are getting smaller, and we have to just be completely comfortable with variance, completely comfortable with what we're doing, so we don't just think, oh, we have a set, let's just raise here so we don't have a tough spot on the turn. Don't be afraid to take the risky line if it's more plus EV. Another example is to stop making plus EV 4-bets when flatting the 3-bets is more plus EV. Deal with playing 3-bet pots in position and out of position and facing tough spots post-flop. Sometimes it's just better to call with a hand like pocket queens pre-flop, despite it being a profitable 4-bet. You're not going to get it in against jacks nearly often enough. You'll almost never get it in against ace-queen. So when you get it in, you're up against, mostly a range of ace-king and jacks plus, and maybe even jacks aren't always going to be there. In that case, you can't just 4-bet there just because it's profitable. You're much better off flatting, and when the flop comes king high or ace high, you're going to just have to deal with it. Stop raising draws just because it makes the hand easier. Stop auto-betting just because it's easier to manipulate mediocre opponents by betting. This is okay if it's more plus EV, of course. This is huge. At lower limits, once again, it's okay to kind of just bet too much if it makes the hands easier to play. You're trying to minimize your own mistakes, and it's kind of okay if you're playing similar to how everyone else is playing and you're just a little bit better at it. Now, we have to move past that. We can't just auto-bet hands because checking's more difficult. Likewise, people play draws way, way too aggressively all the time because they think, oh, well, I can just 3-bet here and it's profitable. And if I call, then the turn spot might be tough, especially if I turn a pair. That's true, but if calling is more profitable than re-raising with a flush draw or a straight draw, you need to do it. Don't just take the easier line and be like, oh, well, I can get it all in now, but if I brick on the turn, things will be tough. Take the most plus EV line. Be willing to use smaller bet sizing and not just make the opponent go all in or fold. So, how often do you see people that pick a sizing because they don't want their opponent to be able to call it? That can make sense, but a lot of times that's just being lazy and they don't want to bet $40 into a $100 pot because they think, well, if my opponent calls, I'll be stuck on these river cards. Once again, that's not okay. We need to overall be willing to make small bet sizes even if we don't want to be called all that badly. So for example, maybe I want to pick a small bet sizing in a spot because if I bet small, my opponent's going to be much more likely to bluff jam. Whereas if I make a really, really big bet myself, my opponent's never going to be able to bluff jam and he's not really going to fold in a way that I want him to fold. So I make a small bet sizing, hoping he bluff jams, even though I know I really don't want this to be called. You have to be willing to take that risk sometimes. If you get called, deal with what happens on the river or the turn, whatever street it is. We are no longer trying to avoid mistakes. We are now trying to maximize EV in every single possible spot, regardless of the variance or the difficulty of playing the hand. So that's just summarizing what I just said. We are not afraid of tough spots at all. We will make mistakes, but we will also improve this way. Extremely comfortable in 3-bet pots. By now, you should be used to having plus or minus 10 buy-ins days, assuming you play a few thousand hands in a day. That's not that rare. Your win rate's probably smaller now. It's okay for you to lose or win a bunch in a day. 3-bet pots are extremely normal and common. You are not responding to 3-bets by always 4-betting or folding, even if you're out of position. So at no limit 50, that's when you sort of start encountering more 3-bet pots, and I expect you to just kind of beginning to understand them. By now, at no limit 200, you should be extremely comfortable with them. They're not a lot different than raised pots. There's, just more money on the line. Be aware of what 3-betting ranges and 3-bet flatting ranges look like from every single position. Be able to quickly count combos. So you're of course going to see your opponent make stupid 3-bet bluffs. You're going to see them make stupid flats. But for the most part, you should be able to realize, okay, if he's 3-betting here out of position, and this is the flop texture, how many pseudo connectors sort of improved? Can he have sets on this flop because he was 3-betting a pocket pair? You should be pretty comfortable with what the value range looks like and also the bluffing range from someone good. Consider using smaller 3-bet sizes in position and calling when the opponent uses smaller 3-bet sizes. It's of course easier to just make your 3-bet big, which discourages your opponent from calling, so then your opponent's either going to 4-bet or fold, and then you can look at the hand you 3-bet, and if you have a value hand, you go all in, and if you had a bluff, you fold. That strategy can work okay, but it's far from ideal. You want to make your opponent defend a wider range and develop a calling range, so when you're 3-betting in position, consider the smaller sizing against the right types of opponents. Sizing in 3-bet pots is very easy, yet most people suck at it. So if you're uncomfortable with sizing in 3-bet pots, that's going to be something you need to fix very, very quickly at no limit 200 because 3-bet pots are going to happen all the time. Know how to set up getting all the money in on the turn with an overbet and know how to bet the turn small as necessary to force the opponent to have a calling range. In 3-bet pots on the turn, you need to be able to both bet 1.5 pot size bets and 0.35 pot size bets as necessary. So 150% of the pot in the right spot, 35% of the pot in the right spot. You need to understand how to do this. Once again, you probably can win at no limit 200 even if you have some of these leaks, but we're trying to fix them now so we can even move up past no limit 200. And if you do have a lot of these leaks, you're probably going to be winning more money at lower limits than you will here. Acknowledge the entire bet sizing spectrum. The statement, most bet sizes and most spots need to have a very balanced range in theory, is true. Pretty much when you're betting, you should most of the time be balanced. There are exceptions, but in theory, you probably want to usually be balanced. The statement, most board textures have a single optimal bet sizing, is most certainly incorrect. There is not one bet sizing to use on every specific texture. There are multiple bet sizes to use on every single texture. People tend to think altering their bet sizing based on the board texture is doing all they need to do. In reality, this is likely enough or even good, but in theory there will be tons of possible bet sizes, each with a balanced range. So this is one of those things that will be very helpful to know at no limit 200, but we're more of starting to develop this now for when we move up and play higher. So this is kind of like what we're focusing on. It's the hardest concept we've really approached so far, and we're trying to learn this because it is a big one before we move up higher. It's one of those spots where I talked about how you would probably want to start understanding equity from limits no limit 50 to no limit 200. I would say you want to start understanding bet sizing well from no limit 200 and higher. So this will definitely spread limits, but start thinking about it now. For example, on a 10 of hearts, 10 of hearts, 7 of hearts, 4 of clubs board with a $20 pot, I might bet between $9 and $22, and each bet sizing will have a balanced range. So in theory, on this flop texture, you could bet $9 with a balanced range, $10 with a balanced range, $11 with a balanced range, all the way up to maybe $22 each with a balanced range. That makes sense in theory. Obviously, the exact sizing, I don't know. I just picked between 9 and 22 because that looks reasonable. I am aware I have not made advanced bet sizing videos yet. These videos will come in 2012. I plan on making these. They're going to be extremely hard to make and they're going to take a while, but I will make them this year unless something goes terribly wrong. Clips. You should be using a ton of different sizes in the same spots, and this both makes sense in theory and crushes in practice. Balance as needed, but this is rarely an issue. This absolutely will tear up mediocre opponents. Manipulating your bet sizing so you're betting bigger when you want him to fold and smaller when you want him to call just fundamentally works really, really well at no limit 200. You would think something that obvious wouldn't work that well, but it does. So be able to manipulate your bet sizing, and if you think, I think my opponent's almost always going to call a bet of $35 and lower, then you're probably going to want to bet $35 for value. And then if you think, I think he's going to fold a lot when I bet 36 or more, then you're probably going to want to bet something like $42 as a bluff. There are obviously, of course, exceptions, and sometimes you might want to make a really, really big bet, even if he's only calling a small fraction, because that will be more profitable with a value hand. But for the most part, just focus on really manipulating your opponent's range and betting whatever you think works best with your hand, and you're probably not even going to need to balance it. Defend blinds like a boss. Absolutely impossible to do, and it's not even close if you are not extremely comfortable in 3-bet pots and donk betting. Donk betting is crucial. Some hands donk incredibly well as bluffs, and some value hands hate giving 2 cards to the opponent. Check calling virtually guarantees 2 cards. Let's talk about this for one quick second. So when you check call on the flop from the blinds, you're probably not going to check raise the turn, and if your opponent bets the turn, you're either going to check call or fold, or if your opponent checks back the turn, you immediately see the river card. So when you check call the flop, your opponent's getting to see 2 cards, likely relatively cheaply if he checks back the turn, or even if he bets the turn, he's getting to barrel effectively. Blind 3-betting ranges are wide, at least 12% from each position and arguably more. Depends on your approach and opening sizing. Get used to stacking off light and being able to 5-bet bluff jam preflop to defend the wide 3-betting ranges as needed. Very important here. Aggro blind 3-betting ranges. You're going to have to 3-bet hands, which you might not be particularly comfortable with if you want to have a balanced range. So for example, if the button opens and you have Queen 5 suited in the big blind, that is probably going to be an impossible hand to fold. You're either going to have to call with Queen 5 suited, or you're going to have to 3-bet it. That hand does not play the best, but there's only 2 positions left to defend when the button opens, and you have to get aggro there. Know how to adjust to the button based on what his sizing is and the raise first in percentages. Have default optimal or go-to ranges and adjust them as needed. So what I mean by that is you should have a pretty good sense of what you're usually defending from each of the blinds when the button opens, and then just being able to adjust it based on how big your opponent opens. So if you made your ranges based on a 2.5 big blind button open, then if he opens a little smaller, adjust it as needed. If he opens a little bit larger, adjust it as needed. If he opens a little bit tighter, so he opens less hands, then you're going to want to adjust that as needed as well. Or if he opens a wider range, you want to adjust that as well. So look at both your opponent's raise first in and his sizing, and then adjust your range as needed. But you should have sort of a general idea of what they look like for a normal player using a normal sizing. You will be defending the blinds non-stop at no limit 200. It is not merely a table of regulars sharing a fish or two, so be ready to clash. So, if you're playing the lower limits, a lot of times it's just going to be one or two fish, and then a regular opens the hand or a regular calls the fish is open, and you're usually going to be combating the fish because the fish play a ton of hands. So if there's four regulars at a table and two fish that are playing like 50-10, almost every single hand is like a regular against a fish, and it's very rarely regulars clashing. At no limit 200, there's not going to be all that many fish, and your definition of a fish is going to change. It might not be a 50-10, it might be a 35-15. And in case anyone doesn't know, when I say 50-10, the 50 is the VPIP, or the voluntarily put money in the pot, and the 10 is the raise, the pre-flop raise. So, your definition of fish will be a little bit different as you move up, and there'll be less fish. So get ready to clash with regulars, so make sure your fundamentals are extremely solid. Understand polarized ranges. Understand what makes a range polarized and how to approach them. Hint. Just about every betting range other than the pre-flop raising range is polarized. The degree of polarization will change based on position, stack depth, streets to act, etc. Whether or not you should have a check calling or check raising range and the frequency of each will change greatly based on how polarized a range is. So clear your mind for 1 second and try to visualize this example I'm going to give. Imagine you open in the button and the big blind calls. The flop comes King 8-4 rainbow. The big blind checks. You bet, and he check raises. You call. The turn comes at 2, and your opponent, who's in the big blind, now checks. What sort of bet sizes there make sense? How polarized is your opponent's range? Well, if he check raised the flop, he's saying he has either a very strong hand or a very weak hand that's bluffing. And then when the turn came at 2, that didn't change anything at all. It literally didn't put any marginal strength hands into the opponent's range, so his range on the turn should still be polarized. That's significant. That affects how you should approach the turn, how often you should bet, what your bet sizing should be. All that stuff is changed because your opponent has a polarized range. It is impossible to not suck at bet sizing without understanding how polarized ranges work. Make sure you are at least paying attention to who's polarized and how polarized they are so you'll get more comfortable with bet sizing. Once again, this is something I expect you to really start focusing on at no limit 200. I don't expect this to be mastered at this limit. It's probably something you're going to really approach and focus on a lot if you move up to medium stakes. I did not understand this nearly well enough when I made my bet sizing series. Most of the information in it is probably correct, and a lot of the concepts, such as overbetting, are spot on. It's just still not a very sophisticated understanding of bet sizing. So even when I made that bet sizing video, and it talked about a lot of, I think, pretty useful starting points, it wasn't nearly as complex as I would want your understanding of bet sizing to be as you move up to medium stakes. So really start focusing on bet sizing, but once again, in order to understand that, you have to really understand how polarized ranges work, how equity works. There's different types of equity. There's a lot to learn, so just start focusing on it at no limit 200. So once you do start beating no limit 200, you won't get stuck there with a style that works at that limit, but won't let you play against really, really good opponents at higher limits. So that sums up or finishes the Quickie series up to no limit 200. So I hope you have enjoyed it. Once again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the forums, and I look forward to reading them. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Want to see your hands in the Quickie? Convert your hand history using the CR converter or post it in the forums.